So I'm going to introduce a statement from civil society which is launching today. But before I do that, I just want to put it in a little bit of context. What are we doing here in Cancun? As everyone knows, we're not here, we don't expect to negotiate the comprehensive legally binding agreement which we still urgently need now more than ever. That won't happen this week, but we think that, and we're cautiously optimistic actually, after the weekend, that we can get an agreement here in Cancun which does at least two things, which rebuilds trust between rich and poor countries, putting the world back on the path that's needed towards the comprehensive legally binding agreement, but that also delivers tangible, concrete outcomes with real benefits for poor people that are suffering, as we've just heard, first and worst from climate change, despite being the least responsible for causing the problem. And one of the best examples of one of these concrete outcomes that we can deliver, that can be delivered here in Cancun, is the establishment of a fair global climate fund. And so we've got a message really for ministers here that are arriving as we speak. And we know that the discussions on the Kyoto Protocol are absolutely vital. And it's very likely that they will use a lot of the time of ministers. And it's right that they do so. But it's also vital that ministers don't allow themselves to become distracted and to fail to deliver real substance in the other areas of the package under negotiation here in Cancun, including on the establishment of the fund. So we're launching here this civil society statement. And I think you've all been handed a copy as you came in. And it's important to say that this has been signed by over 200 organizations from civil society in the north, in the south, in every region, from big global networks like Climate Action Network International, other networks like PACHA, members of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, of Jubilee South. It's really a cross-cutting civil society statement, and it sends a really clear message to those ministers that the establishment of a fair climate fund in these talks is absolutely critical. Now, we have seen convergence over the last year on the need to establish a climate fund. It's one of the positive stories of the climate talks this year. But the message here is don't just come away with any kind of fund. That won't do. What we want is a particular kind of fund, a fair climate fund, one which marks a new path in the management of climate finance flows. And why do we need that? We need that because there's a problem with the current system. We think that the current arrangements for managing climate finance are really broken. They're not delivering the money to those that need it most and can spend it best. We've got a plethora, a spaghetti bowl of different climate financing channels, numerous funds out there, and they're all delivering relatively small pots of money and usually in one-off amounts. So developing countries are faced with an unfair burden of having to shop around a range of existing channels for these one-off amounts. And each of these channels has got their own reporting requirements, eligibility criteria, application procedures. It's incredibly burdensome. What we want to see established is a fair one-stop shop for climate finance, which gets the money to where it's needed. But there's another problem with the current system as well, and that's that there is a huge and gaping adaptation gap in the current arrangements for managing climate finance. We think that less than 10% of current climate finance flows are going to adaptation. The vast majority is going to mitigation. And that's a tragedy for those poor people around the world who are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. So that needs to be addressed in the design of a new fund. So that's the problem. What's the solution? It's outlined in the statement. You've all got a copy. I won't go through it in detail. There was also an eco article you might have seen today, which also outlines the call from civil society. And I'll just give you 5 highlights of the kind of fund that we're looking for here in Cancun. So the first principle, if you like, is that we need this fund to be established under the United Nations. Why is that important? It's important because this is the legitimate home of discussing climate change and therefore of discussing climate finance flows. It's the only forum in which all countries are represented, including poor countries, vulnerable countries. So they need to be the ones which are in ultimate control of the new fund. Second, we need to see equitable representation. That's a strong voice for developing countries on the board of the new fund. Who controls the cash? We need to make sure that unlike many of the existing funds, this won't be a donor-dominated fund. This will be a fund which gives real voice to developing countries. It's they not only that have the the right to that finance, but also they that know how to spend it best. Third, as we said, we need this fund to be a one-stop shop. There's no good just establishing another fund, but seeing finance continue to be channeled through a range of other institutions. So we want to make sure that in the text being negotiated here, there's a clear agreement that the vast majority of public finance flows contributed by developed countries are going to be channeled through this new fund. There's no point setting up an empty shell here in Cancun. We want to mark a clear path, and we want to make sure this is where the money's going to go. Fourth, as I said before, we need to address the adaptation gap. We can't have the continuation of 90% of financing flowing to mitigation and less than 10% flowing to adaptation. That's got to be addressed. It's a serious problem. There's no need to wait longer. We know it's happening, and it's always happened under the Climate Convention. Ever since climate finance was first discussed, we've always seen it go to mitigation over adaptation, and that needs to stop in Cancun. And it can be stopped by including in the text that's being negotiated a clear commitment that 50% of the funds under the management, of the resources under the management of the new fund, should be directed to adaptation. In the Fast Start Finance Agreement, struck in Copenhagen, they agreed that there should be balanced allocation between mitigation and adaptation. That wasn't good enough, and what we've seen is that still in the Fast Start Finance contributions which rich countries are making, they are prioritizing mitigation over adaptation. So just calling for balance doesn't do it. We need a clear percentage, 50%. And the final thing, which we're going to hear more about, is the importance of women to this new fund. We want to see this new fund set up with the concerns of women at its very heart, running from the top to bottom. That means that on the executive board of the new fund, those that are going to control the cash, we want to see women fairly represented. And if we don't address this specifically and explicitly in the text, what can happen? Well, we saw it with the establishment of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel to look at climate financing earlier this year. And what happened? Of all the members, I think there were 19 members, all were men. Now, if we know, and we do know, and we'll hear more about it from others on the panel, that it's women that are affected first and worst by climate change, but also they that have the solutions in their communities. If we know that they're so vital, then they've got to be the ones with a voice on the board in deciding how this money gets spent. And they've also got to be prioritized in the policies and programs that this fund is set up to deliver. So those are some of the highlights. That's what we mean when we say a fair climate fund, not just any climate fund. And if we've got one message to ministers arriving here, yes, sort out the Kyoto Protocol by, absolute priority, but don't let your eye off the ball. There's political decisions needed here in Cancun which can set a new path for the management of climate finance. And if they deliver that by the end of next Friday, we can genuinely call Cancun to be a successful COP, and it will put us back on track to the long-term agreements that we need to tackle climate change. Thanks.